Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Reed with Regenesis, and we will be unpacking what it means to engage in regenerative development and design today. Just a little bit of background about my past history. I've been doing environmental design work since the late 1970s, one of the early passive solar designers in this country, and then founding board member of the U.S. Green Building Council, one of the co-founders of the LEED rating system, developed a protocol for integrative systems design, because when you do LEED, you got to integrate all those points. It's not one point at a time. And that question led us to ask, where do we stop integrating? And the answer is probably metaphysical, but in the meantime, we certainly need to be integrating life. So I was invited to join the Regenesis group about a year after their founding in 1995, because they were working on the same thing at a much deeper level than I could conceptualize. And it's been a journey ever since, trying to figure out how do we engage humans and the living systems that support us in a co-evolutionary whole. So here we go. So to kick this off, a quote from Gregory Bateson: "The major problems of the world are the result of the difference between the way nature works and the way people think." One of the things we think about is fixing carbon, fixing climate change by reducing carbon. We hear it all the time. People are getting rightfully panicked. And the question is that going to be enough? And from our perspective, nope. Sorry to say. If we fix the carbon problem, whatever that means, by the way, we will be left with multiple destructive impulses in our culture. We're destroying the world in lots of ways, whether it's monoculture farming, destroying soil, plastics in the ocean, habitat discontinuity and destruction, that center slide, basically our whole social justice idea and how we take care of each other. Folks, we got a whole myriad of problems we got to address. And we address carbon, we'll take ourselves down other ways. So this is a system issue that we're addressing. And regenerative development is about regenerating our capability to work with complex systems, regenerating our ability to work with life. So some questions, though, to consider, and the gaps in our thinking. Will current sustainability practices get us where we need to go? And we know that we've been doing this kind of work for 40 years, and it's going the wrong way, folks. So something's not working. If you or your organization were to work on being an instrument for change, what might you work on? What are your leverage points? What are our leverage points? And if we get there, where is there? Where are we going? How do we sustain and evolve it and deepen it? Let's say we reach a threshold. Do we fall backwards? How do we keep growing that capability to actually live in a way that's appropriate for supporting all life? So what are we sustaining with sustainability is a question that actually some people struggle with. We're not sustaining PV panels. We're not sustaining sustainable paint. We're not doing sustainable buildings. By the way, there's no such thing as a sustainable building. We're sustaining life, not buildings. Life is the process of becoming. It's the best definition of life I've ever heard. The process of staying in the game of evolution. Life, it turns out, almost seemingly in contradiction to the second law of thermodynamics, life runs up. It increases diversity and resilience in the face of where most situations that we provide or build actually suffer from entropy, rust, decay, slow down. Life runs up. Now, it depends on the sun to do that, but within our sphere of the earth, life, it actually keeps working. So whether it's a forest system or a child or a chrysalis, they're evolving into something new with greater potential. So what about life? I think it's fair to say that biology is firmly in charge of what's happening on this planet. You look at these two pictures of the Earth and Mercury, I think it's a great contrast. Living systems have created all the coral reefs and the diversity of species and the mountains, well, that's geological, but the White Cliffs of Dover are all done by biology. And for a force that is so powerful, restoring a stable climate is well within the realm of possibility if we actually turn to nature to provide that service for us. It's unlikely that we are going to fix this with a technology fix, a machine that extracts carbon out of the atmosphere. We have a process for that already. It's called photosynthesis. So a little bit of background. We call this the trajectory of ecological design. On the left-hand side is conventional design. Randy Croxton, architect out of New York City, says that we build our buildings one step better than breaking the law. So we know that we can do this. We know that we can actually do better than that. And so LEED has come along, or Green Star, or the Living Building Challenge, or WELL. So that's basically saying we can do better. So if at code is the conventional way, we can do 50%, 70% better. That's a green building or a green outcome. Sustainability in that context is seen as zero. The question is zero sustainable? And likely it is not. In fact, zero is almost impossible. There's always damage being caused to the environment when we build our buildings. So we not only need to stop doing the damage, slowing down the damage, or I think it's Bill McDonough that says sustainability is a slower way to die, is that we need to actually start working on restoration and regeneration. Now, these are two different dimensions of a very similar approach, but regeneration does not mean restoration. Restoration, let me give you a definition for restoration. Restoration means that we are restoring the possibility and processes of evolution within an ecological subsystem. So a wetland, a forest, a beach dune system, a riparian corridor. What we're doing is giving enough scope of interaction with a diversity of species that it begins to actually heal itself. That's a restoration process. The question is, what happens 10 years later when we're a culture that has forgotten why that was restored? And we say, I need a shopping mall there. Well, we don't need all that restored area. We can need it for a parking lot. So part of what regeneration is about is regenerating our understanding of how to engage in restoration on a full-time basis and to keep it going. So what we are regenerating is not necessarily out there, although that is another synonym for restoration. What we are regenerating in the context of our practice is we are regenerating the human spirit and will to engage in this system ever after, forever. So you need that circle basically is defining the whole thing, is that we have to be doing the limiting the damage. It's important to do LEED buildings and Living Building Challenge buildings, et cetera, but we also need to be working on restoration and regeneration. Well, what does architecture and construction and engineering have to do with that? And we're going to get to that. One other point I want to make, this is all set up here, is that restoration is what we would call generative. It is not regenerative. Is pretty important. It means you're doing it again. So how do we actually go through birth, life, death, rebirth cycles, so that it's the re-engagement and the capability of a culture to re-engage that actually defines regeneration. All right, one other way to get at this, so I'm doing this broad framing, is to work with Carol Sanford's 4 paradigms, which I think are particularly brilliant. At the bottom level, the conventional design is extract value. We're extracting value from the earth. We're taking energy and carbon. We're taking nutrients from the soil. We take spirit from our employees. All that's extracting value. Now, the flip side of that is receive value, that is an exchange in value. That's actually a lot better. But unless we are conscious of the overall negative extraction, we dig ourselves into a hole, which is what we're doing on the planet right now. So the next step then is what we've been doing in the sustainability movement: arrest disorder or slow down the damage. That's a good thing. Is it enough? And I don't think we've gone over that. So the next level is the do good level. And the do good sounds pretty good, except when it isn't. So when is do good not good? Do good is not good when we impose our idea of good on another culture or a system. And I think we can recognize that in the international development community. We take European and North American centric ideas and impose them on Africa. We know how well that's worked out. So do good is a form of colonialism, actually. Even with our children, if we do good, I want you to be a tennis player because I'm a frustrated tennis player, even though my daughter wants to be a dancer. That's an imposition of will, of of my particular worldview on her. And she'll be on a psychologist's couch for the rest of her life, likely. So doing good can actually be pretty negative. So what's the antidote to that? The antidote to that is evolve inherent potential. Now, that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how do we re-engage to understand the inherent potential of every living entity, or the entity's, person's, place, innate capability, intrinsic nature is what the philosophers call it, or essence. So that core nature of every living entity, we need to understand and be humble enough to understand for us to engage them on their own terms. And with that, we launch an incredible amount of energy for self-regulation and healing processes. All right, that's a bunch of gobbledygook. Let me try to get now to go down and help us understand this. So just a little more on it, evolve inherent potential, whether with people or life sheds, not just watersheds, life sheds. Every living entity asks that we approach it individually to reveal and support its unique capabilities. Do good. The other definitions are here for your review later on. So how do we support its unique capabilities? What do we have to do to understand it? And that's what we're talking about today. So inherent potential. Little girl, likely to be an airplane pilot. Sebastião Sagato's family farm in Brazil. After he burned himself out photographing war scenes around the world, he retired to his family farm, which had been desiccated and destroyed. 10 years later, though, it looks like this. Nature has inherent potential if we work with her on her own terms. The Loess Plateau in China that John Liu filmed, 30 years of effort that didn't go anywhere. Finally, they asked the farmers what to do, and within a year and a half, it was a verdant place again. That's how fast. By the way, the subtitle, I know that the abstract for this talk was Healing the World in 18 Months. I like that because it's a little bit incendiary, because how can we do that? But it's actually possible if we work with nature on her own terms. That's a big if. And what this work is about in terms of architecture and construction and working with planning and community city infrastructure is how do we engage the people who live in our cities to engage with nature on her own terms. That's the secret, if you will, or the trick to begin to engage in a sustainable and regenerative relationship with life on the planet. So 18 months from desert to that. 2 months after COVID, there's Beijing. The Earth wants to recover. This civil engineer's view of a stream in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a cement stream because it was putting total suspended solids into the Chesapeake Bay because the floods from the parking lots in the north were ripping it up. Well, once we learned to control the water leaving the site, this is what this looks like 3 years later. Same view. Well, turned 180 degrees. So nature recovers very quickly. And the inherent potential of our places, whether it's Pittsburgh, Barcelona, Seattle, Park City, Utah, they're living organisms and they are unique. And it's up to us to understand that. If we don't understand them, we actually impose our idea of doing good on them and we end up not so good. So what does inherent potential of life have to do with architecture and construction? Let's get into now with a case study, and then we'll unpack how these work. This is a 20-year-old project. I use it a lot because it's small enough to get our hands around. The Brattleboro Food Co-op in Brattleboro, Vermont, called us up to do a LEED Gold grocery store. And we ask all our clients, do you want LEED or do you want sustainability? Because there's a difference. Green is important, but it's not necessarily leading to a sustainable condition. So they gave a great answer. They said, well, we want both. And that was a good way to begin a project. So we did a little bit of research on the context within which this place sits. And one of it, the inherent potential of Brattleboro, its essence, if you will, is localization. Slow food movement has a big foothold there. They do community revitalization. They have the March of the Heifers. What town has the March of the Heifers every year? So food is very centric. And so we took a look at food, and we found that the average bite of food in the United States travels 3,600 miles. Now, I used to travel 10 to 20 miles at the most. So we did a tour of the grocery store. The first meeting, we met with the executive committee. We went to the produce section. We went to the apple bin. And the first apple we turned over had a New Zealand stamp on it. So you can see where the 3,600 miles comes from. There were strawberries from California, blueberries from Chile. You get the idea. So, they said, yeah, we're concerned about this because, if there's a truckers' strike, they're out of business in 3 days. And if Whole Foods comes into town, they're probably out of business in a year. So what's the one thing that a truckers' strike or Whole Foods can't compete with? And that's local food. So this is the design of the grocery store, is how do we bring back the food cycle to this town? All those green areas on this map are basically abandoned farms. And not all of them, but most of them. The best, and the soil is degraded by multiple extraction periods over 300 years. The best soil was in downtown Brattleboro, but we built on it. No, you've only built on 35% of it. Most towns fed themselves during World War II in their backyard gardens. It's incredibly productive. So we made a proposal. Why don't you plant food and everybody plant gardens to grow food for the grocery store? And so we had an agricultural and soil extension service to teach people how to grow their own food again, a cannery where they could can their food, a daycare center to take care of the kids when the parents were doing that work, an abattoir for hunters to dress their meat because it's a big hunting area, a credit union to start loaning money for small farmers to reestablish farms in those outlying areas, and a Forest Service extension to begin to work with the restoration of the soil in those degraded areas. Oh, and by the way, a grocery store. So the executive committee was really excited about this big vision, and we were rushed to do a presentation to the board, and a board member said, all we wanted was a grocery store. And what is this BS? So we were let go that night. We realized we made a fundamental error and that we had looked at the system of land and food and building, but we had not looked at the system of the people. It was a big learning for us. And so we wrote a long report, handed it in, got a call a year later from the board president saying, Bill, this is the best thing that's ever happened to us. We want to apologize. We understand what you were doing now. We have a 100-year ends policy that we're now implementing to incorporate this kind of thinking. The building itself wasn't as important as we thought. The building itself is an acupuncture point to engage in a larger systemic change. The typical relationship is we build a project and we figure out how to be in relationship to the various stakeholders and issues that are facing us. We flip that and we say, let's look at what the health of the system requires. And then we enroll and engage the stakeholders in the community to see how they, in their particular interest areas, whether it's mobility or gender equity or climate change or habitat connectivity, what they in their interest areas can do to support the nature of life in that place. And all of a sudden, it takes about a year, but all of a sudden, relatively quickly, people are aligned and pulling their oars in the same direction and getting out of their silos, which is a gigantic issue in our culture because we all work in our individual silos and we don't talk to each other and we do fundraising for our NGO activities and we guard that money jealously. We are so fragmented. And this is a very powerful way to begin to engage people in common purpose. So the other thing is that not only were we working on the health of the Brattleboro area, the co-op realized we need to be a better neighbor to other co-ops. And so the larger system was the co-op system in northern New England. And they began to support each other and loan resources to each other and education and background support. So the stone that got dropped into the pond in Brattleboro rippled out to begin to heal the ecosystem, local farming, and the local co-op movement in an even larger system. And that's the point that we're trying to make. We do not have a long time on the planet to keep living the same way. We actually need to engage massive change. We have to engage all of us in our passion, but pointed at a common direction. And this is we've experienced this as a very powerful way to do so. So let me just summarize that what we've learned so far, regenerative projects seek to develop the inherent potential, added value, if you will, in everyone and every living system they touch. This is how communities become regenerative. They build the capacity to become self-managing, self-investing, and self-evolving. The design of buildings emerges from that understanding because now we know how to respond and what to respond to and what to support. So, is this practical? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this slide. Again, this is something you can think into on your own. But we have some big limitations in our thinking in our culture. We simplify complexity. We apply a mechanical worldview. Ever since Aristotle, we've been actually dividing humans from nature. And then we've been working on reductionist thinking, the scientific method. And the scientific method has been extremely valuable, but it has also been extremely destructive. Because when we reduce a living system to fragments, we cease to understand it. When we dissect a frog, it ceases to be a frog. And do you know what a frog is after that? No, you may know what a frog's liver is, but you don't know what a frog is. So we need to be understanding and attempting to understand life on its own terms, not ripping it apart into smaller fragments. But it's not either or. Like I said, we've learned a lot about the world by that reductionist thinking. Abstract thinking, save the earth. What does that mean? Tell me how you're going to do that. It's one of the reasons why you haven't done it, because there's no CEO in charge and no one has a clue what that really means. So we have an idea, but we save the biosphere. We have sustainable outcomes. Impact. What's impact, by the way? Sounds kind of negative to me. And there's no such thing as sustainable paint, concrete, sustainable cars, or sustainable buildings. It's a sustainable system we have to engage in. So one point I want to make right now, and I'm going to come back to that, is we can't save the earth, but we can save our places. Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work on common pool resource, proved that Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons, which is actually what's happening on the planet now, we would withdraw as much as we want from the ocean because it's not my ocean. We pollute the air because it's not my air, not my responsibility. That tragedy of the commons is how we're destroying life. But Elinor Ostrom proved that in place, we actually see the results of our thinking and we adjust for that, even when not asked to. So we believe by focusing back on place, on the places we live, we can heal the earth. So we heal the earth place by place. And in aggregate, by the way, there are 4,000, I'm going to pull this number, 4,037 cities in the world larger than 100,000 people. If we get a tipping point of 3.5%, which is kind of the norm for tipping points, that means 141 cities, I think my math's right. If we actually transform 141 cities, we will save the planet. So it's something, a little piece of hopeful hyperbole, perhaps. Fragmentation happens, is what I talked about before. Hyperbolic or exponential discounting. With multiple choices, we conserve energy for those issues most likely to happen. We don't look at the system. We take those things that we can actually understand and address. That further fragments the systems of life. And the idea of the map is not the territory. Typically, we are conscious of a very small portion of what is happening around us. We map it out, and every tool, I love this point, every tool we use informs us about what information to ignore. That's the implicit, we address what we want to address, and we ignore a lot else. So how do we actually work as a system? And that's where we're going right now. So how do we practice a renewed way of being in relationship with life on the planet? For one thing, we have to recognize that technology is not going to solve that problem. It is our being and our will that needs to be addressed. How do we actually unleash will to co-create with life? How do we adopt our ancient role to work and co-evolve with life on its own terms? To be inhabitants, not occupants. To be indigenous, and that means of place. To be indigenous in our place. To be humble and caring so that we can be effective in working with each other. Because if we're not going to be able to solve it. So there's a lot of systemic issues that need to be addressed concurrently, and this is a practice to do so. Humans do have a role to play in nature. We believe pretty much that we have destroyed nature and are destructive, and we are indeed, but some of the healthiest ecosystems on the planet, meaning more diversity of species and more diversity of relationships, which, by the way, adds to a dynamic stability. You notice as we flatten the Earth systems, we have more destructive events. So prairies, for instance, just to give you an idea about what this means to have more diversity of species and relationships, prairies can handle drought, fire, insect infestation, buffalo stampedes, tremendously cold winters, and so on, tornadoes, and yet they would recover because there were complementary species to fill different niches depending on the different climate systems. That's what gives us stability. So we need that diversity of species and relationships. Native peoples understood that, and they developed a fire regimen to actually create a more complex ecosystem. That happened in the Northeast, where Native peoples would burn the land in the spring and the fall, and these were called cold fires. They would actually destroy the thin-barked beeches and maple trees, but allow the thick-barked chestnut, hickories, and oaks to survive, which are nut-bearing trees, which would allow a greater proliferation of species and resources to feed others. It was after Europeans got here and then settled with row crop agriculture and diverse grazing animals, et cetera, that the beeches and maples came back and included the chestnut, hickories, and oaks, and we ended up with a much different forest. By the way, the Louisiana Purchase, the average number of trees in the Louisiana Purchase, when surveyed, was 7 trees per acre, not the dense forests that we think are natural to forests in North America. This is because the Native peoples were managing it in an entirely different way. And these trees, though, were gigantic trees, circumference of 16, 18 feet. So I love this quote from the book Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson, which addresses this point. California Native peoples believe that when humans are gone from an area long enough, they lose the practical knowledge about correct interaction, and the plants and animals retreat spiritually from the earth or hide from humans. When intimate interaction ceases, the continuity of knowledge passed down through generations is broken, and the land becomes wilderness. So the point of today is to bring ourselves back into relationship again. All right, now we're going to unpack some principles. How do we shift our understanding in relationship to life? How do we actually recover that inhabitation knowledge instead of being just occupants on dirt? Developers say we're going to buy some dirt and build buildings. Well, that's what we do, and we buy dirt and we keep it dirt. And it's the health of soil, by the way, that is actually the foundation for health of life on planet. So we really need to be addressing and getting our head around understanding that our role is to actually amplify the health of soil to support all life. So, quick summary of what we're going to go through. Life works with potential, an inherent potential, that innate capability. It doesn't work with problems. The willow tree does not argue with the oak tree about exchanging nutrients. The willow tree does not say to the oak tree, sorry to anthropomorphize here, but it makes a point, is that the willow tree is not saying, you really made me angry last week, oak tree, because you took some of my nutrients. I'm not going to give you some this week. That isn't the way it works. Is that everybody is participating together in mutual benefit. Life is understood in wholes, not fragments, which is a corollary to working with problems. To work with the largest manageable whole are the places we live. Wholes are also nested because, you think about which whole do I work with? This whole, my family whole, my community whole, my lifeshed whole, or my site, my neighborhood, the watershed, which whole do you work with? You work with all of them, and you have to understand the need and the role for each whole relative to one another, because value needs to be exchanged in both directions. We have to add value to the larger whole and receive value for the larger whole. So it's a reciprocal relationship. Life harmonizes and adapts. It does not compromise. And that's a whole big subject. And of course, looking at our politics in not only our country, Europe too, where we're actually, probably the whole world, we are continually trying to win and beat up on one another rather than really understanding common values and what is at the core of concern. And life is a co-evolutionary process. It's continually emergent. You don't solve a problem. Solving problems is looking backwards. It's like driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror. Actually, we always need to be looking forward and prepared to what is ready to emerge, anticipate that, and be ready to address the issues that are emerging. There's no such thing as being in control. We are not in control, but we can cooperatively engage. So this requires a constant practice. And the deliverable for a regenerative project is building the capacity and capability of people to co-create in the places they live and co-create with life. All right, now let's unpack those. Work with whole living entities. So, yes, a forest is an entity, a city is an entity, an individual is an entity. We are bounded, and what's a whole? Here's the definition of a whole. A whole is singular, it's alive, vital, and it is evolving. So take my body, for instance. I'm singular. I'm alive for a while anyway, until I lose nutrients. So you need nutrients too. But let's just talk about the current state. I'm alive right now, and I'm bounded and not bounded. This is really interesting. There's not a boundary around a whole. It's both bounded and not bounded. My skin is a boundary, but yet it breathes. I expirate, I take in food, ingest, I breathe, I eliminate. I would be, if it was truly a boundary, I would be dead. And if it was not a boundary, I would be a puddle, equally dead. So there's this incredible, wonderful paradox of a boundary in living systems. The other thing about working with living systems, working with a whole, is that you can't understand it from parts. So that's why we have this diagram of organs. I do not understand you by looking at your liver and your kidneys and your skeletal structure and your DNA sequencing. It may help me get an idea about you, but I do not understand you. It's the same example of the frog. So if I took all your organs and skeletal structure, et cetera, and put it in a pot and stirred it around, do I get you? I don't. I get a mess. So what we actually are looking for is to get to know you. And by the way, we do this in our cities too. We look at mobility or habitat connectivity, or all these different things that we have in the LEED rating system, for instance, and we put them together and glue them together and think that we have a whole system. We do not. We have a bunch of fragments. So the way that we get to know a whole, the way that I get to know you, is by getting to know you in relationship to other people and other living and non-living entities. Those are invisible relationships, which is one of the reasons why we have such a problem working with living systems, is that we're actually looking at invisible energy, if you will. My relationship with my spouse, my relationship with my kids, my pets, dogs, my colleagues. Those tell people more about me than my liver would. So, though that understanding is determined by looking at patterns. The patterns that are replicated over and over. And that's how we get to know people. That's how we get to know cities, is observing those invisible patterns and see how they're manifest. It takes a little bit of time, but it's an indication, and it allows us to be non-generic in addressing people and the places we live. One of the other things that you're probably being a little bit overwhelmed by all these different points is that the parable of the blind man and the elephant actually is pretty useful here. This takes understanding life on its own terms, especially from a reductionist point of view, which we've all been trained in. We're hardwired for it now. Takes multiple laps around the elephant. Do I have a brush? Do I have a tree trunk? Do I have a vacuum cleaner hose? Do I have a spear? What are these things on the elephant? And maybe if we take a couple laps around, we realize we really do have an elephant. So this takes some time to reframe the way we think. Another thing about working with wholes is that these wholes are systems, and systems are typically defined as elements and interconnections, elements and relationships. However, there's a third aspect of defining a system, and that is a system has to have a purpose. So I think most of us from North America would know that those parts are a bicycle. But if you've never seen a bicycle before, you wouldn't have a clue until you saw somebody riding a bicycle around. So we actually have to understand the role or the purpose of these systems we're working in. That whole system we're talking about, what's Pittsburgh's role, purpose, if you will, in relationship to the larger system that it's part of? We actually need to understand that. So here's an example about how that works. This is a project we worked on in 2008 before the financial collapse. The developer was going to put 1,000 3.5-acre homes on this alluvial plain. This is in Idaho, just to the west of the Three Sisters, the Teton Range. In fact, the Three Sisters are right behind us in this plane that we're flying in. So when he proposed that, he was run out of town by the community. He fired his architect. He hired another architect who heard about our work, and we were brought in, and we said, we're not here to be a shill for your development, but we are here just to represent nature and how we can actually harmonize, not just get into conflict, with human habitation and nature working together. And so that meant we had to understand this place on its own terms. So to make a long story short, if you can see this, this is the Teton River in front of you. This is what was a savanna, prairie savanna, and the Big Hole Mountains. And so we walked around here for a couple weeks, talked to a lot of people. We interviewed the forest ranger in the Big Hole Mountains and said, well, how's it going? He said, well, the mountains are dying. Well, why? Well, it's been dying for about 100 years, ever since they put the dam in that cleft right in the center of the photograph. Farmers put a dam in, and they took 90% of the water from the streams that were coursing through this alluvial fan. I think you can see those faint lines that are all woven through the farm fields. Those are former streams from the Mahogany Creek. Mahogany Creek basically goes off there to the right, barely has enough water to reach the Teton River. So 3 ecosystems were destroyed when the farmers built that dam. The Teton River no longer gets fed water. The farming has created over an abundance of nitrogen, which is polluting the Teton River. It used to be a great salmon river, no longer. The salmon are no longer able to go up those streams because the water doesn't exist anymore, and that is what nutrified the Big Hole Mountains, the forest in the Big Hole Mountains, because the salmon died up there after they laid their eggs. The animals took the salmon out of the stream and nutrified the forest floor. So the nutrient cycle was broken. And so just like there's a hydrological cycle, and by the way, if we all only depended on the hydrological cycle, we would all be standing on rock right now or have webbed fingers. There's the opposite force is the nutrient cycle, is that nutrients actually are taken uphill by insects, birds, fish, megafauna, etc. These streams had beaver, otter, a lot of large animals bringing nutrients upstream. And when that was cut off, it destroyed these 3 ecosystems. So that land, those farm fields you see there, actually have a role to play. And that role was, it served as a living bridge between the Teton River and the Big Hole Mountains. So once we understood that, we were able to take that to the developer and said, if you could actually re-engage this water again, take down that dam, allow the water to be released through that. And by the way, even if they built these 1,000 homes, it would have only taken 10% of the water from that stream versus 90% for that monoculture agriculture. Those are turf farms and barley, by the way. Not much production going on there. So it was possible to harmonize human habitation and nature by understanding the role that land played in that system. Okay. Now, oh, by the way, there's the soils map to prove the point, that the nutrients from these streams were actually coursing through this landscape for centuries. Now, what does that have to do with urban areas? Because we don't all live in rural areas. Jane Jacobs talked about this since the 1960s, and she used the term regeneration. If you read the Introduction to Death and Life of Great American Cities, you'll pretty much learn the very similar things that I'm telling you today. So the pattern, the intrinsic nature of the Lower West Side of Manhattan was eyes on the street. That if the families in these apartments were not able to see the street, if the shopkeepers were not able to see the street, they weren't able to protect the kids. And so the life in that street would actually have been occluded because they had to keep the kids inside because they couldn't actually protect them from the wise guys around. So eyes on the street was critical. And if we built a LEED platinum bank building in the middle of this block and didn't honor that essence of culture in that place, we would have destroyed that social ecosystem. So both of these go hand in hand. Both social ecosystems and ecological ecosystems are determined and able to be managed by understanding their essence. So nested holes now. Now we've talked about holes. How do we actually determine how to add value? And I gave that example about in Idaho, that you basically, if you understand the role it plays, you can now begin to think about what role we need to play in the larger system and what that system needs, how that larger system needs to honor the role that this land has to play. This is an exercise that I wish we had an hour to do, but again, this is homework. And so the inner whole may be your project, maybe your organization. This is a conceptual idea. And then there's value-adding processes to the greater whole, the whole that's outside of you. In fact, there's multiple wholes, but this is just making it very simple. And so the assignment is, what is the context that directly impacts and is directly impacted by your project? And you need to look at all these 5 capital areas. There's other capitals out there, meaning where do you get return on investment and where do you have to invest to get positive return on investment? These 5 capitals are from the Forum for the Future in London. Social capital, environmental capital, human development, meaning our own growth, spiritual and educational, infrastructure capital, and economic capital. We have to be adding value in all those 5 arenas. So what are those 5 arenas? Can you actually determine that flow of reciprocity between the inner whole and the greater whole? Describe those impacts. What does that context have the potential to become if you're paying attention to those impacts? What forces prevent it from doing so? And then you'll know the role of your project. Then the project can be truly informed by its place. So as I said before, place is the largest manageable whole. And we can heal the earth place by place. I'm not going to repeat that, but it's really important to emphasize it. That we are actually, and it's not that we shouldn't pay attention to the planet. You've heard, global. There's certainly global issues and there's local issues, and we need to be paying attention to both. But we can actually have real effect in the places we live. Work with potential, not problems. Life is the process of becoming. Life runs up. Always work with potential. Don't look backwards. Because the minute we start dividing life into problems, we've fragmented. When I hear someone talking about, we're going to work on social justice, I think, well, it's a nice idea, but it isn't going to be whole, or it's not going to be sustainable unless we understand the role of social justice and how it's informed by the ecological health in that place. Now, the other thing I threw this slide in is, this is really important, is just like nature cooperates, we actually need to cooperate too. And Susan Simard's work in the mycorrhizal fungi networks is really profound, because these trees are actually communicating with each other and actually support one another. There is a mutual benefit going on here. And with that, this is one of the more profound frameworks I think we are ignoring in our culture. This is called the law of 3. Right now, our culture works with duality, win-lose, heart-mind, Democrat-Republican, science-religion, that kind of thing. And we think it's a battle between those. It is not. And in fact, as long as we actually think it's a battle, we will compromise. We will actually lose-lose. And in fact, compromise, just like sustainability is a slower way to die, compromise is a slower way to die. We need to excise that out of our language. It's not the height of political sophistication. It is a cop-out of reductionist thinking. Compromise, compromise, compromise. We drive ourselves into the ground. So nature harmonizes. How do we do that? We look at potential. And if you could, again, anthropomorphize nature, nature isn't worrying or whinging or whining about if a hurricane comes through and destroys an ecosystem. It gets right back to work. Pioneering species, early succession species, mid-succession species, climax growth. It keeps working forward and builds diversity and resilience because it knows that it can heal itself. So nature doesn't have problems, it has potential. And I want to read this quote from Donella Meadows, the famous systems thinker. We cannot impose our will on a system. We're not in control. We can listen to what the system tells us and discover how its properties and our values can work together to bring forth something much better than could ever have been produced by our will alone. So what I'm trying to convey today is that we have the resources if we take the time to think about the context and the system and the way life wants to work in the places we live, and then partner, co-evolve with that. So this diagram, by the way, this potential, this harmonization, is a way that we get a lot of work. This client down in Chile, this is an oil tank farm in Viña del Mar, Chile, just north of Valparaiso. And the client said, if you can harmonize conflict, that's worth 15 years worth of lawyers. And we don't believe you. We don't understand how you do this, but we'll give you 2 months to show us what you can do. We said, well, we're game for that. So there were 25 activist groups in this town, all calling this developer, a big corporation in Chile, all calling this developer the enemy, in quotation marks. They all refer to it as the enemy. Oh, you're working for the enemy. Yes, we're working for the enemy. Why should we listen to you? Well, we're working for the enemy. The enemy brought us here, but the enemy actually really cares about this project. They're getting rid of this oil tank farm. They want to clean up the brownfield, but they've asked us to come in to work on the health of the whole city, because that's how we actually harmonize everybody. So we're looking at what will make this place healthy again. Yeah, that's what we're concerned about. Good, because how is fighting against one developer going to help you get a healthy city? And of course, no one had an answer to that, because fighting one developer is not addressing the real issues. So this is what Viña del Mar looks like. One street, it used to look like this all over. It's one of the most famous garden cities in the world. They borrowed English garden city tradition from the late 1800s. They used English culture as a major cultural resource back then. Beautiful, beautiful city. Well, this is what it looks like now. You can see in the lower right-hand side, the trees are now no longer taken care of. The lower left, the Valparaiso Bay is a dead zone. The estuary, that is the source of life for Valparaiso Bay, has literally been turned into a parking lot. It's unbelievable. The architecture is destroyed. So the site is in the yellow. What we look at is we actually, when we talk about place, we ask people, how big is here? And here, people defined as about 20 to 30 kilometers out. So we're actually engaging people in how the farms work, how the vineyards work, habitat connectivity, where the water comes from, where the water recharge areas are, and so on. So we worked with the community and the community members to understand what really made them tick. And one of the things that actually really struck home to them is we observed that every time there was an intervention by a culture, whether it was the Congo Indians, the Incas, the Bata, the Spanish, the English, agricultural systems, railroad systems, industrial systems, every time there was interaction, the system improved. But 30 years ago, it went off the rails, and they said, you noticed. And that was when we were able to engage them, because they saw that we actually cared about their place, and we were able to be in dialogue with them about why it went off the rails. And it went off the rails for a lot of political reasons, but no one is really caring like they used to care. And so we said, well, can we actually work together? Well, we don't know how to do that. Well, let's get together and talk about that. So the potential was innovating succession, or compounding resilience, if you will. And within 2 weeks of meeting with 18, I think we met with 17 or 18 of those 25 activist groups, within 2 weeks, most of them went from extremely negative to enthusiastic or supportive, because they said, we've never heard people talking about cooperation this way. That's all it took. It wasn't that, this isn't mysterious, but it was a cooperation in service of something larger. Government doesn't usually take care of that. Government typically addresses what's the reactionary situation or problems. But what we're working on is the potential. So again, there's this diagram. We're working with a larger system that we're part of. We're not working on a transactional relationship, like we'll give you a swimming pool if you give us permission to build. We'll allow you to use our athletic facilities if you give us permission to build. We won't build a tower so big if you give us permission to build so many square meters. Instead, we're saying the developer is no more or less important than the other stakeholders in the community, and we're all working together to serve the health of that larger system. And by the way, the developer wants that too. That was something we had to point out to the people, is that the developer wants quality of life in this community because that's going to support their investment. So everybody realized we want quality of life. Now, how do we work together to get there? It's a very simple invitation, but we typically don't take the time to do it. And by the way, we typically save 18 months on, similar to what nature recovers in 18 months. The number of times we have heard, how much time did you save in entitlement or permit time, is 18 months. We've saved up to 10 years on projects through entitlement by working this way, by engaging the community and co-creating their future. So what goes on then is we're building a relationship between people, and that has to be done consistently. Life is a practice. There's no such thing as a change management weekend. We don't come in and wave a checklist and say, here's your sustainability program. You actually have to practice this. No different than exercise or a musical instrument or a language. It takes time. To think that we can actually dictate sustainability is really kind of silly. So what we're doing with these community members is building an ongoing collaborative field, an energy field, if you will. Meaning that, and what happens when you build a positive energy field is you're actually building an attractor. And the opposite point, if you ever gone into a conference room after a bad argument has taken place, like a wild argument in this conference room, you open the door, and what do you feel? You feel some pretty negative energy. You say, I'd rather go be at my dentist than come into this room. So this positive energy field that happens when you start working this way in community attracts others. And what happened after the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce did not want to talk to a couple of gringos from the States. He said, we know how it works, we don't need to talk to you. The mayor actually commanded her staff not to talk with us. But 10 months after we started this process of monthly meetings with groups who were interested, the word started to spread that something different was going on here. So we had consistent meetings at consistent periods of time, and they were effective meetings, because most people don't know how to run meetings. So what we're doing is helping people understand how to organize and run effective meetings with results. That builds a field that began to attract others. And 10 months into our work there, the ED from the Chamber of Commerce calls our client and says, Ricardo, I don't know what you guys are doing, but count us in. This is the first time the city's been able to dream in 30 years. The mayor took her a little longer, another year, but she called up and said, okay, I see what's going on. This is great. We want to play. Now, it sounds like a slow beginning, but once you build that field, massive change is possible. So I like to think it's not a matter of scaling, although scaling is important too, but field building is probably more powerful. I don't think we need to go through the design is really not important, but the design transformed because of what we learned in the context and from the community. The estuary, the ED of the Chamber of Commerce, the estuary was not near the development, but the ED gave $4 million to begin to restore the estuary, working on this larger system. So you see how this works. It's just not about the development. It's about the city as a whole. First of all, place is your home. It's non-threatening. It's not religion. It's not race. It's not politics. It's your home. It gathers people together. It's non-confrontational. Humans are social beings. We want to be in relationship, but we don't have purpose anymore. The church used to serve that purpose. We don't have that. We have Facebook. So we know how well that's working out. So basically, place and the health of our place gives us potential and purpose to serve that potential. And then it's a simple practice after that. Continually regenerating ourselves in relationships to develop and evolve. It's an ongoing practice. It never stops. I just ran across this quote from Simone Weil. Place is a doorway into caring. Love of place unleashes the personal and political will needed to make profound change. It can also unite people across ideological spectra because place is what we all share. It is the common that allows people to call themselves a community. So, I want to underline this, achieving a healthy system is not a one-time event. It is a process of practice. It's a process of continually regenerating ourselves and our relationships to evolve. And by the way, we need to be working on self in this. Now, how do you work on self? This is not a church. This is not a landmark course or an est course or whatever self-help book you might be reading. But until we are working on our own state of being, let me say it, make it simple. If I'm a jerk, I'm not going to be very effective working in a group. And therefore, the group is going to be broken apart because it's the group, the team, the collaborative of people that actually are able to work effectively in a system. So again, it's a nested system, self, group, and system. And so what we help people to see is their role in the health of the group. And all we do is we ask people to reflect and self-observe and actually remember when they've tripped themselves up and actually engage people, ask permission, and you have to accept that permission to say, yeah, I screwed up. I need to actually clean up my act. So there is a developmental process not only out there in the evolution of the system, there's a developmental process in here and the groups we're working with. I love Kathia Laszlo's quote, sustainability is an inside job. Quote from Christopher Alexander, when you build or restore, you cannot merely do this in isolation, but must also repair the world around it and within it, so that the large world in this one place becomes more coherent and more whole. And that which you make takes its place in the web of nature as you make it. Last slide, courtesy of Anna Pollock, the sustainable regenerative travel consultant. Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. If you're struggling with all this stuff that I've been downloading here, maybe it can be actually encapsulated here. Is if you can actually get in touch with your own essence and allow yourself to get in touch with the essence of the places and the people you work with, that aliveness will work tremendously. Don't push it. It will pull people to a whole new worldview. And you could ask yourself, what about place? If you don't understand how to work with this essence, you shouldn't from this just an hour talk. What is it about this place that makes you come alive? If nothing you can sense, what would help you flourish? What might we do and who do we need to be to enable this place to flourish? That's the fundamental design question that green buildings actually need to engage in to make the green buildings actually get a foothold to begin to heal the world. Well, thank you for paying attention for an hour. I hope that held together for you. It's definitely a weaving of some level of complexity, but it is extremely fulfilling and important. And once that paradigm gets shifted, it's a different world to work in. And it will create an incredible traction and health on the planet if we can think not only of the technical things we're working with, but the living systems that actually truly are supporting our lives. Thanks, everybody.